G'day guys, how's it going? So in this video, we're going to look at nested loops in Rust and the kind of complications that you can have when using them, right? And trying to get out of one to ultimately get out of both, right? So there might be a situation where the inner loop defines the outcome for both loops and you need to get back to the top of your code. Uh, that can be tricky. And I'm going to demonstrate that with an example here. So the example I'm going to use is student courses, where we have like a little mini DB, which is just an array, and that array has each item in the array is a tuple, right? And then that tuple has an array inside that. And what we want to do is we want to target any student or any tuple that contains a course ID of 1 in its array and return the first result, right? So find the first student ID who is taking the course with ID 1, which in this case is 6, okay? If 1 is found, print the student ID, otherwise print the ID couldn't be found, okay? That's the goal. So let's go through that process. So the first thing I normally do with a loop is I define what the length of the loop's going to be so I can exit out of it, right? So I go let student course db length, and I'll set this to student course db.len. Whoops. And then I'll look and say, okay, the internal array itself is always fixed to 3 records for the moment. So I'll go let student course len equals 3, right? And that's not going to change. Then I'll have a variable that I want to search on. So I'll say, let's have course ID to search. And this will be the course ID that we want to find. So I'm going to set that to 1. And then we're going to begin our loop, okay? So the first thing we want to define for our loop is our index. So we go let mute student course db index, set that to 0, and then we start our loop, and then we increment this. So student course db index plus equals 1, and then we add the if condition to break out of it. So we can go if that is higher than or equal to the db length, like so, then we're going to break out of the loop, right? So that's our first loop inside of this application. But we're going to want an inner loop to process those courses. So now we can add another loop just here quickly. But just before that, we need to define what that inner loop index is going to be. So we can say something like let mute student course index, set that to 0. And then the same deal, we're going to come over here and we're going to pretty much copy what we've got here, but in this loop. And then we're just going to update the indexes accordingly. And instead of it being the DB length, we're going to go with the student course length, right? And I'm just going to comment this out for a second and make sure that we get out of these loops, right? And to the end of the program. So just going to go print line. We got to the end of the program. Cool. Now, if I run this, we can see we got to the end of the program, right? So we've got our double loop in place based on using the loop keyword and using indexes, right? So now we need to go through writing the logic. So let's put this course ID to search back in. And the first thing we want to obtain is on the first loop, we need to get the tuple information, right? So I'm going to destructure that out myself. I'm going to go let student ID for the first value, and then courses for the second value. In fact, I might just call it student courses. And I'm going to say it's equal to, right, student course DB at student course DB index, right? So we're getting that. We're getting the tuple at this index, wherever this index is at the time. So if it's 0, it gets the first one. If it's the next iteration, 1, it'll get the second one, so on and so forth. And then it's assigning the first value to student ID and the second value to that array. Cool. So now we've got our information. We can go into this second loop, right? And basically just before we update the course index, we're going to want to get out the course ID from this array. So now I'm going to go let student course ID equals student courses at student course index. All right. And now that we've got that, we're now going to check if the student course ID matches the one that we're searching for, which is this course ID to search. If it matches that, we're going to break out of this loop. Now, I'm going to stop the code there for a second and run it. I'll probably not worry too much about this warning here. But if I try to run this, we're going to see we got to the end of the program, right? Which is fine. But what we haven't proven yet is what student ID is actually going to get assigned here. And it's like, okay, we need to have a variable for that, right? So now we come up here and we're going to capture what the found student ID is. All right, make that mutable so we can actually assign it at a later stage. And I'm just going to set this by default to -1, okay? And at the bottom of the code, where this print line is, I'm going to say if, what did I call it? Found student ID. So if found student ID is greater or equal to 0, we're going to print out that we found it. Otherwise, we're going to print out we didn't find it, right? So let's deal with the one where we didn't find it first. So I'm going to write here, let's say, no students were found for course ID, and then we're basically going to grab that course ID to search, right? Because we couldn't find it. However, if we do find it, we need to print out that. So print line, and I'm going to say first student, because remember, this is the first student we're looking for, with course ID, and then it's this here, is, and then we got that found student ID, right? Now, for the moment, when I run this, it's going to say we never found it, even though technically we did, right? No students were found for the course ID 1. And that's because before we did the break, we need to assign here, found student ID is equal to that student ID, which gets rid of both those warnings also. So now if I run it, we're expecting potentially that we're going to get 6, right? But what's going to happen is the answer we get is 8, right? And you're like, well, how's that the case? Well, that's because currently we're only breaking out of this internal loop, right? Which means that, yeah, we're not doing the rest of this stuff because we don't need to, but we're not getting out of this outer loop either, right? We need to get out of this outer loop. Now, there's a few ways we can do this, right? And one way is the way I wouldn't do it, but I'm going to show you this way anyway. We could say something like, we have a variable, and we could go, in fact, we could assign this as an expression. We could say has found course equals loop, right? And then when we break, we could just say true here and false here, right? Then within this loop, just after the expression, we could go if has found course, right? Well, we're going to break because we don't want to continue any further. Now, will this get the result that we're after? We run, and the answer is yes, it does. All right, we now get the student 6 for course ID. Now, we've had to add in this extra Boolean logic to get around the fact that we're using an internal loop to process each course, to find that course, to then say, okay, here is the first student with that course, right? but we have to add this extra if condition to get out of the outer loop, right? Wouldn't it be great if we could just, within this inner loop, leave both loops? Can we do that? The answer is yes, we can, right? And the way that we do this is using something called an outer loop, right? So we'll leave this mutable variable in for the second, but to create a label, right, that we can use, you have this little quote just before the loop, and then you give it a name, right? So I'm just going to call it outer, and then you put a colon and a space, and now this is given this loop, right? This loop here, it's given it a value, right, of outer, which means that if I want to leave internally here, I can just go outer right down here, right? I can say break to the outer loop, and you don't need that second quote. It's like that, right? And I can do the same with the one down here as actually, I don't want to do the same with the one down here because I want this to continue looping through. All right, so this now just goes break. Now, the issue with this is this Boolean now is going to have issues, but we don't actually need it anymore because we're only using it to get out of the outer loop, right? So we can remove this like so, get rid of that semicolon, and everything will act the same way, except now, instead of breaking directly out, hang on, what's happened here? Oh, it's just my IntelliSense. Instead of having to break out and then do another check straight after the loop, it'll just leave both loops right here if it finds something. Otherwise, it'll just continue through and looping through, and then eventually, if it doesn't find anything, it'll come out and eventually get to the bottom here. So this was quickly confirmed that this still works. And it does. Now we can see it got to 6. So it's detected it here. Oh yeah, student ID is 6. And now we're going to break all the way back out to this outer loop, leave this loop, and then go and execute this if condition, right? Now we can take this one step further. We can actually assign this outer loop a variable as well. At the moment, we're assigning it up here as a mutation, and then we're assigning it inside the inner loop. Cool? So what we can do is instead of just assigning break outer, we can actually return here the student ID as part of the break, right? So now we don't need this anymore, right? We can also just break here, but we need to probably break with a -1, right, to indicate, hang on, what's happened here? Sorry, 1 second. Found an integer. Wait a second. I don't think I need that there, or do I? Interesting. I think it's failing because I haven't specified the let yet. So if I come over here and I instead get rid of that line, and then here I go equals to outer, and I get rid of the mute, yeah. It's still throwing it out. Oh no, there we go. So now on the outer loop, it still wants me to send something out. I haven't found anything, so I'm going to break with a -1 there because I'd never found anything. And now, because this is now a variable, we have to assign a semicolon down here. So it sounds like a lot, but essentially all I did here was say, okay, not only am I going to say leave to the outer loop, I want you to return the student ID at the same time. So now it's captured the student ID here. It's been able to understand that it's really meaning to capture it on this outer loop, not this loop here, right? And then basically that means I can set it as non-mutable, and then I can just do a simple little if condition at the bottom. And if we run this again, right, like so, we're still going to get 6, right, which is great. Now, if we change this to a number that doesn't exist, say 9, for example, well, it says no students were found for course ID 9 because there isn't one. Cool. So that is how we can simplify a nested loop if we're having to search through, say, multiple levels of arrays, right? Different nested arrays. So that's all I'm going to do for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.